Good morning. My name is Edgar Hertwich. I'm a professor of industrial sustainability at Yale University, and it's my pleasure to be invited to talk to you. I was asked to talk about the role of society in stopping climate change with the title, Science Alone Cannot Stop Climate Change. Human attitudes must change. And as you will hear, I will not mainly address attitudes, I will actually talk about institutions, but we'll get there. So first, we'll look into what is climate change, and you have been looking at this question also this morning. What are the consequences of climate change, and how could we halt climate change? And we'll find that only radical change is able to stop global warming at an acceptable level. And therefore, a change of course in our development is needed. But there are significant obstacles on our way, and I think we'll identify some of those obstacles and discuss how we can gather and organize the resolve that is needed to achieve this change that is required to stop the climate from changing beyond the 2-degree threshold. And I will introduce some moderately successful examples that maybe can help us glean at social and institutional changes that can bring us there. So if we get started, what is climate change? This animation here actually shows the role of CO2 in the atmosphere, if I can get it started. And so in the figure, you see an absorption spectrum. This is basically the atmosphere seen from above and the radiation that comes through, and that's the long wave radiation. And as the animation goes along, you see the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere increasing, and what that does to the flux of the outgoing infrared radiation. So we can see as the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere increases, the CO2 absorbs more and more of the outgoing infrared radiation. Of course, that infrared radiation is then re-radiated by upper layers of the atmosphere, and so in the end, all the heat gets out, but a higher surface temperature of the Earth is required in order to achieve that cooling, and that is basically the mechanism by which the climate is warming. We have understood this science for about 120 years now, and there's really not much uncertainty about it, and the properties of the gases that we are emitting that are causing this effect can be measured in the laboratory, and they have been done so for many decades. What happens if we don't stop global warming? Well, the important implication of the previous slide is that as our CO2 concentration increases, the warming increases. If we want to stop the warming, we need to stop increasing the CO2 concentration. This is a picture from, yes, you might have guessed it, the campfire in California last year, and the sort of damage it did. And this is just one of an increasing number of events that with increasing frequency cause havoc in different parts of the world. Right now, there's a massive damage being brought by a tropical cyclone in Mozambique, and the country is struggling with the aftermath right now of the largest storm ever recorded there. So what will happen if we continue from having warmed by 1 degree from pre-industrial level to 1.5, 2 degrees and beyond? I'm referring here to results of the IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that investigated the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius and how this compares with the temperature increase of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's global average temperature. And the 2 degrees is basically the target that the global community has set itself. And the 1.5 degrees, the wish by some island states of what we should aim for. And what we see, the difference is, for example, the frequency of extreme heat. So at 1.5 degrees, 14% of the global population will experience episodes of extreme heat. With 2 degrees, this will increase to 37%. There will be sea ice and a sea ice-free Arctic once every 100 years under warming of 1.5 degree, but once every 10 years under warming of 2 degrees, and this has dramatic consequences for the ecosystem there. There will be a slight increase in the level of sea level rise that we can expect. There will be more species loss, actually significantly more species loss that is expected of vertebrates and of plants and of insects if we warm to 2 degrees rather than 1.5 degrees. So I think you get the picture, right? Fisheries will decline more rapidly because fish actually prefers colder water, which actually not that fish prefers colder water, but colder water is more nutrient rich and therefore more fodder grows in colder water, and so there will be less fish available as we warm, and that is also a significant consequence. So there are all these consequences that basically let some people conclude that we should halt global warming at the lower level sooner rather than later. And so, well, I have worked as part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Given my background in physics and engineering and as an industrial ecologist, I have contributed to the third working group that addresses the mitigation of climate change. Specifically, I was a lead author of the energy chapter in the last assessment report. And I sort of feel very much along the lines of what this cartoon wants to tell us. Basically, the question that the climate science community has to the world is there anybody out there listening to us? And it seems like slowly there are people listening, but you really wonder what's going on. So, can we halt global warming at 1.5 degrees or at 2 degrees, as is the target of the Paris Climate Agreement? Well, maybe, but really, we are not going there right now. The Paris Agreement, with the commitments that different countries have made, moves us to 3 degrees warming by the end of the century. And that is assuming that the countries will stick to this commitment. Right now, there's very little indication that the US is willing to undertake the steps that President Obama committed the nation to. And so there are also other countries that will use that as an excuse to also renege on their commitments. On the other hand, actually, a large fraction of the international community is united in this cause against climate change and is taking at least those moderate steps that are committed under the Paris Agreement. But as you see in the left-hand part of the curve, that really doesn't get us anywhere near close to where we need to be. If we want to achieve a 2-degree target or even a more ambitious 1-degree target, we need to start reducing emissions now. And emissions, while they have been stable for a few years, are growing again on a global level, and that, of course, should be a reason for concern. So this animation indicates different emissions pathways that would bring us to the 1.5 degree target. And what you can see is that we either need to sort of drop burning fossil fuels pretty immediately, or we need to plan for a massive, and I'm talking about really humongous enterprise of absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere at some point starting in 2040, 2050. And the energy system in the current scenario models is the main tool with which the CO2 would be removed from the atmosphere again through a technology called bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage. And these aggressive bioenergy scenarios would actually reduce the availability of nutrition to the population. I personally think that all of these scenarios are very challenging to imagine. It is very challenging to imagine the sort of large scale and rapid transformation of the energy system. But it is just as hard to imagine that we would marshal the resources that are needed to remove CO2 from the atmosphere at any significant scale. And so the question is, how can this be addressed? To provide you with some more information about the changes that are needed, this is a specific scenario that achieves the 2-degree targets. The other curves were sort of an animation drawn from hundreds of scenarios that have been made. But here you can see the role of the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and you can also see the rapid reduction in emissions from greenhouse gases, so that the black line provides the net. The LOC is land use change, so there is an option that we have to start either reforesting areas that have been deforested earlier, for example, the Northeast in the US, where this is already happening, or to have agriculture that absorbs more carbon in the soil, and that can help us to reduce the CO2 concentration, absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. But we need these carbon negative technologies on a massive scale, and that would have a dramatic influence on the amount of fossil fuels that we use and on the amount of new energy that we need to bring online. Now, what is remarkable with this scenario is, first of all, the amount of energy efficiency that needs to be applied to make it happen. Right now, we have a rapid increase on the globe of energy consumption, of course, mainly in emerging economies that are finally getting away from their energy poverty to a level of living and comfort that we would find just basic and natural, and that's important. So there is a lot of efficiency built into this scenario. And then it is the rapid onset of modern biomass replacing traditional biomass, of wind power, solar power, and nuclear power, and at the same time the reduction especially of coal, but also of oil and natural gas in the energy system. Are we on track? Well, the International Energy Agency has an annual report about that, and it says no. They were on track in 3 areas: electric vehicles, solar, PV, and onshore wind, and energy storage. These are areas that have seen tremendous success in the last decades. But there are many areas in which we also need to act, where there's moderate progress or where there's very little success or activity at all. For example, in this important area of CO2 capture and storage, this is something that is actually very expensive to do, but most of the scenarios cannot do without it. So unless we really go to a rapid decline in energy consumption that has tremendous implications for the lifestyles that we can achieve. The problem is that while we are talking about climate change and the technologies that are needed and the policies that are needed, and is there enough political will, our developments are really going in the wrong direction. Now, this is a new airport terminal, and this happens to be the Oslo airport where I fly through quite frequently. But there are so many new airport terminals. Beijing is opening the largest airport in the world. Istanbul has just opened a new large airport with that will in the end have 6 runways. And so this is just one example of things where we don't know how to decarbonize aviation. We cannot have an exponential growth of the amount of air miles driven and at the same time fight climate change. It just doesn't work. There are other developments that are incompatible. It is the way and the speed with which development proceeds. So here, this is a picture from in China, from Tianjin, and you can see all these towers that have come up where people live in these large 40-story buildings. Well, there's nothing wrong with these buildings per se, but the average building lifetime in China is 23 years, and we just cannot afford to build new buildings at that rapid pace. This is one of the areas that I'm working on right now. So why is this happening? And what can we do about it? So here, there's a quote that I would like to show you that says, "There is still time to save the world's people from the catastrophic consequences of pollution, but time is really running out." Any idea where this warning comes from and when it was made? Frank Eichert in 1965. This is before I was born. And who was this person? He was the president of the American Petroleum Institute. So the industry has known for half a century that this problem exists, that it is serious, and that it impacts their business on a fundamental level. Here's a longer section of that speech which was republished in a scientific journal last year. Well, if we have known for this for a long time, why haven't we started pursuing mitigation pathways? I took this figure from the very first IPCC report that was published in 2001. Actually, that wasn't the first one. Sorry, this was in 1990. But the point here is that since 2001, we have not pursued a mitigation pathway. We have pursued a business-as-usual pathway. Sorry, the IPCC did not start doing emission scenario that early, but anyway. So it's clear that our approach is not adequate to address climate change. We knowingly stumble into this situation where the situation is getting worse. We now see the consequences every month in front of our eyes, and we fail to act in an adequate fashion. Why is this the case? And what to do instead? There's really a problem with the way the whole situation presents itself. The main way by which we know about climate change is through science. It is a scientific theory that has a lot of scientific support, where numerous attempts to falsify it have failed. But the population knows through climate change because we tell them about it, right? And then we hope that the population does something with this knowledge. But what's the theory of change that we have as scientists? It's really an information deficit model. It's like, well, we're on two different sides of a fence, and the scientists come up with the knowledge, and they throw a paper plane across the fence, and then they think that somebody there is interested in the knowledge and will react in response to it. Information triggers action. The actors will do something about climate change if they understand what we tell them and know what is required to stop it. Well, that's not really happening. There is no information deficit. There's a cacophony of information. People are disoriented by the flood of information with which they are presented and have and it's increasingly difficult for them to understand how to evaluate the information they are presented with. And society is also not amorphous. It's not just, a mass that's unorganized, or it's not run by a benevolent dictator. It is organized into interests. And so this model of change is clearly inadequate. And I'm afraid that we haven't come up with a good model of change. So I've been thinking about this. It's not my profession. I'm not a sociologist or political scientist or whoever would be the right person to do that. But of course, I've been struggling, like the scientist in the cartoon, with the observation that nobody is reacting to the information that they have been presented with. How can we go from scientific knowledge to social change? So there are various problems with the way the issue of climate change presents ourselves to us. I think we are actually still quite ignorant how the societies work. There's a general issue. There's an issue with this being a global problem that requires collective action by all the nations in the world. It requires international coordination. And so how do you achieve that? Do we have mechanisms by which this collective action can be initiated and sustained? And this is one of the most important ones. There are people whose material interest lies with the carbon emissions. And I will talk more about that in a minute. The costs and benefits of mitigation, of avoiding emissions, are unevenly distributed. The costs are now, the benefits are in the future. The costs are mostly where the emissions are, that is with the global north. The benefits are mostly with the global south, where people don't have the resources to protect themselves from the changes that are coming. And there is this tension with the fossil fuel exporting and importing countries, where it's clear that the fossil fuel exporting countries have a material interest in exporting more fossil fuels, whereas the importing countries maybe have some interest in avoiding those imports. And so, of course, we don't have institutions that represent the interests of the future populations, and so they are not part of the decision making that we undertake today. And then finally, I think these non-governmental organizations and environmental groups increasingly mimic scientists, experts, rather than mobilizing political will. And that's also an issue that I think is important. So now let's talk about the interests for a moment. These interests are massive. If we really want to stop global warming, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. And that includes fossil fuels that have been identified and that are part of the balance sheet of corporations that are both listed on the stock exchange and unlisted, owned by governments. This figure here, which is from the carbon tracker, displays for important companies how much of the assets that they already think they own they cannot burn if we are serious about stopping global warming at the 1.75 or 2 degree threshold here. So this is what we call stranded assets. Stranded assets is maybe a term that you're familiar with from the electric utility deregulation period. We also call them unburnable fuels. It is investments that we have made that have lost economic value. Of course, for the people who own these assets, if they can stop a policy to stop global warming, then the assets will remain valuable and keep their value. And that's, of course, something that they would like to fight for, and they do. There was recently again that the New York Times has reminded us that there has been a concerted scientific campaign to sow disinformation and to confuse the public and policymakers, politicians, about what we know about global warming. And one of my colleagues at Yale, a sociologist, Justin Farrell, has published several papers in high-ranking journals where he actually traces the influence of those social groups in society. And he has found that there are over $2 billion that were spent on lobbying efforts by important companies like Exxon and by interests like the Koch brothers. And so the actors and organizations that are supported financially by the fossil fuel industry, my colleague shows, are more influential in these discussions, networks, and groups that oppose action on global warming. So the opposition to climate change mitigation, the denial of climate change, is a well-funded and well-organized interest, and that has a substantial sway over the media. It has a loud voice on the public square, and there is really no countervailing voice of the same strength from a political movement that favors doing something about climate change. This is just about my colleague's study. Another Yale scientist here, historian Timothy Snyder, published a book last year that he called The Road of Unfreedom, where he basically traces the most recent history of Russia and how Russia's government has shifted its whole perspective with the re-election of President Putin after Medvedev's period. And Putin has lost legitimacy with his old model because he was re-elected, and now there is no new mechanism for renewal of the government. And so he actually needed to create discord in the outside and basically make the Orange Revolution and similar color revolutions unattractive. And so he has started, and this is part of the background why the Ukrainian war has been started. But Timothy Snyder also traces the influence that Russia has had on the Brexit referendum and on the election in the US. And it's quite impressive to which degree the changes happened in Russia. And I see as part of the background that the moneyed interest in Russia, the oligarchy, finances itself to a significant degree out of the oil and gas revenues that the country provides. And so these interests have also an agenda of sowing discords to undermine any efforts of climate change mitigation by the global community. Now, what are the positive forces? And so climate change has become an agenda that many support, including wealthy people, but we have to be careful about that support. Anand Chiriandras published this book about 2 years ago, where he chronicles his own experience through becoming an influencer and reflects on the whole mechanism by which the public discussion has become dominated by the moneyed elite. The World Economic Forum, the work of the Clinton Foundation, the Aspen Global Institute, TED, are mechanisms by which our public debate is being influenced by powerful people. And his argument is that certain topics have become taboo, that the easy solution are promoted through these mechanisms, and discussions of underlying problems of a more systemic nature are not favored and therefore pushed aside in the way that we address and approach these problems. There will always be managerial rather than political solutions that are being promoted. Taking a step back, I wonder what makes us special as humans. And so this brief history of humankind by an Israeli professor points out that the strength of Homo sapiens, why we have prevailed over the other human species that coexisted with us on this planet, is because we were able to organize ourselves. We were able to organize our interests in larger groups, going beyond the family and the immediate extended family groups that have dominated human history for most of the time. And the mechanism by which we do that is actually the belief in something that he calls interpersonal reality. It is something that's real for the members of the group without actually being physical. For example, a god or gods, nations, markets, money. These are all institutions that we have formed, or belief systems which help us to organize societies and to propel individuals to actions that maybe they would not undertake if they didn't believe in this. He also indicates that in the last centuries, science has become a force of competitive advantage, and that peace and prosperity have been enabled by social institutions, principally the government, and by markets. Recently, we have seen globalization and a sort of cultural unity. There is actually only one cultural space in the world, and whatever happens in China influences us, and we influence what happens in China. And so we have developed a shared history, a shared story of humankind. Well, if that's the case, that should actually help us to stop global warming. It points us to the existence of already a shared culture that would make it would enable us to organize ourselves and to do something collective, to overcome this collective action problem. However, what are the institutions that we have to stop greenhouse gas emissions? Can we shift course, given that our institutions currently promote growth, subsidize airplanes, protect oil markets, and things like that? We need to create institutions that coordinate action, and we need to create incentives for individuals, companies, organizations to follow in the direction of reducing emissions. Well, maybe the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change could be such a global institution. It certainly tries very hard, meetings every year with lots of heads of ministries and governments and increasingly corporations being present. This was the Paris Agreement 3 years ago that was sort of a hopeful development overcoming the difficult setup of the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. But is it doing enough? And we have already seen that the pledges are not sufficiently. But the problem is really with the way the mechanism has been set up. We basically set up a mechanism of policymakers, top down, and the question is there enough bottom-up support to support those actions from the population? Well, this, I want to go back to a book that was published almost 20 years ago by political scientist Robert Putnam at Harvard University. And he argued that American social capital was in decline. And what he says social capital is basically the ability of a society locally to organize itself, to define its collective interests, and to provide a way in which these collective interests can be preserved and advanced. And so he has tons of measures of participation of the individuals in groups, for example, in churches, in unions, in service societies, in political campaigns. And for all of these, there's a downward trend. What he identifies instead, that instead of organizing ourselves in unions or churches or through memberships in service clubs, we make contributions, we make financial contributions, maybe even to environmental causes like the World Wildlife Fund. However, these organizations, they just have a head office, and they act through lobbying, and maybe like WWF, that they have a ground operation in some nature reserves, but it's actually not an opportunity for individuals to become involved. There's no social capital in an organization like the WWF. And he ties that to the rise of multi-channel television and the internet, living in suburbs, an automotive society that separates individuals from each other. So he has a multifaceted explanation for this trend, but he bemoans the trends and thinks that it actually contributes both to a decline in the quality of life, but also to a decline in the institutions that society has available in order to respond to specific problems. Recently, Berkeley economist Robert Reich, who also was Labor Secretary under Bill Clinton, published this book where he bemoans rampant egoism. He basically says that there was an understanding of the common good, at least in post- or World War II society, and that this understanding has been undermined by the egoistic actions of selfish individuals, like the boss who he met on the street in Berkeley of Wells Fargo, a bank that sold people fake bank accounts and made them sign insurances that they never needed. So people have enriched themselves by doing things that are either harmful to others or that imperil the interests of society at large, and that social institutions are endangered by that. Social norms have shifted. While this would have not been acceptable earlier, we see it now as a given, and sort of grudgingly accept this, and more ways in which we need to protect ourselves against these selfish actions are being created, which actually reduces our quality of life, that we need to go through this hassle. At the same time, he observes that lawmaking has increasingly removed itself from public interest. While there was a high correlation between the laws that were implemented through the 1970s and the will of the people, today there is absolutely no correlation anymore, political scientists have found, between those two elements. So he argues that we need to rediscover the common good. We need to work for the common good. And I wonder how we will do this. And I think that social institutions are needed for that. So what's the way out? For me, it's clear that society needs to change. This is not just a technical problem. Yes, it's a technical problem. I've done research on this. there are solutions, and we need to employ those technical solutions. But we will not employ those technical solutions to climate change without having a political, a social, and a cultural change. We need to provide a narrative. People need to recognize themselves in these efforts that lead to a change. And this narrative needs to be inclusive. The globalization narrative, the narrative of economic efficiency, which has been the dominant narrative in industrialist societies over the last decades, really doesn't work anymore for a lot of people. And so, and I think we should aim at reversing social fragmentation, both to create social units that can bundle the political will to make those dramatic changes to our energy system, our system of consumption and production. Only action in groups can get us there, not action by individuals. So I'm pretty hopeful. This is one of thousands of demonstrations that happen in Europe now with increasing frequency by pupils, by students, high school students, university students that protest the insufficient climate policies of their governments. This was started by Greta Thunberg, a 15-year-old, now 16-year-old girl in Sweden who took every Friday off from school in order to protest in front of the parliament in Stockholm against the climate policy of the Swedish government. I would like to draw a connection to earlier research that I have undertaken. We have looked at the carbon footprints of different populations and basically tried to understand in an EU finance project whether there are populations that systematically have lower carbon footprints than what we would expect otherwise. And what we have found is that there are so-called initiatives, that there are people living under certain theme that can achieve those reduced emissions. We also found that individuals acting just by themselves are actually not very successful, and that those individuals who profess high environmental values have comparable and sometimes even higher carbon footprints than other members of the same socioeconomic groups. And so we think, out of this research, I think that thinking to act in groups and forming groups with the intent to act on this issue is going to be a very important element in any political movement, in any cultural, social change that we need to achieve in order to prevent the temperatures from rising beyond 2 degrees. We need to be able to influence social norms. This is just a figure from our paper where we document that these lifestyle initiatives have systematically lower carbon footprints in specific final demand categories, in specific consumption categories, than other populations that we used as control groups. So I think it's important that we create these self-reinforcing mechanisms. It's important that we have tools to measure carbon footprints. We have done that. It's important that we have technological alternatives that people can adopt. But it's also important that there's a story of how the society as a whole needs to change, that these groups can act to help society in the stage where we are now. We clearly need larger scale initiatives than the initiatives of like 100, 200 people that we have studied. But we need to create and found these communities that are committed to action. And what is needed is political change and policy change. Thank you for your attention.